Hello audience. In this video we're going to start putting together this engine. Now this is a General Motors 3800 V6 Series 2. This particular one came out of a 2002 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. And if you're wondering, no, I didn't run out and buy yet another project car. This one belongs to a close friend and I'm kind of repaying favors by working on this. Also, I want to point out that this is a naturally aspirated 3800. There's some rumors going around that all Monte Carlo SS's had supercharged 3800s. That is not true. They were also available with a naturally aspirated 3800 like this one. Now, I took this apart in a previous video, and if you haven't seen that already, I recommend you do. But if you haven't, here's all you need to know. This had about 230,000 miles on it when I took it apart. It was overheating really bad, a lot, and it had some really bad clanking sounds to it. Well, taking it apart, we discovered the water pump had the impeller gone. All the blades were just rusted off. And later on, I took the freeze plugs out and I discovered the entire inside of the block was packed really good with mud. How that happened, I don't know, but no coolant was circulating at all in the block, so that explains the overheating. Also, we discovered the piston to cylinder wall clearance was quite a bit. It was like 11 thousandths on some of them that I measured. So we're going to do a cheap overhaul on this. I already ordered a rebuild kit, and we're just going to put the contents of that kit in this. I'm not going to measure and blueprint absolutely everything because I just don't really have time for it right now. So let's get started. So this is the rebuild kit that I got. This is from D&J. Found it on Amazon for about 320 bucks. Now what it does have is a complete engine gasket set for the upper half. In other words, from the head up. Complete set of standard pistons. Set of main bearings, rod bearings, and rings. Here I'm talking about what was not included in the kit, but was advertised that it was. What I didn't know at this time was a week later I would get another box in the mail. This is the rest of the gaskets and cam bearing set. New pan gasket, front and rear main seals, bunch of O-rings, timing cover, rear cover, water pump, oil pickup. I love this. D&J. Nothing more American than the stars and stripes, an eagle, and a sticker that says Made in China. So here's the crankshaft. Now, I really should mic the journals to see how much wear is on it, but I don't have a 2-inch to 3-inch outside micrometer, so I'm just going to assume they're good. The journals, they do have some gashes in them, probably from contaminants in the oil. So what I am going to do is just go around them with a little sandpaper to smooth out any burrs that it might have, because they can scar the new bearings. And if you're wondering, I'm using 800 grit, which is probably a little too fine for this, but I have it laying around. Starting with putting the new main bearings in. And I'd like to point out that half of these bearings have oil grooves in them, the other half don't. Now, the way the original bearings were set up, the ones in the block had oil grooves and the ones on the caps did not. As a general rule, an oil groove will decrease the capacity of a bearing but will increase the oil circulation, and one without a groove will do the opposite. Now, the bearings on the cap take a much harder beating than the ones on the block, so the ones on the bottom have no oil groove and these have an oil groove. I'm putting a little assembly lube on the bearings. I don't know if you can see it from here, but the second main bearing also has the thrust surface on it, so I'm making sure to put some lubricant on that as well. The flex plate is just on temporarily because it's a convenient place to grab the crankshaft from. Now, as I've mentioned before, these bearing caps do have sort of an interference fit, so I would plastic gauge this just for fun, but they're such a hassle to install and remove, I'm just going to put it together. Because even if it was out of specifications, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. And I'll point out that the cap was marked from the factory, number 1 and forward. I keep emphasizing to mark these and make sure not to mix them up because I cannot believe how many people do not. And if you mix them up, it gets really hard to, well, sometimes impossible to put it back together in the right order. Now, the book instructed to get the bolts caught and then carefully tap the cap down with a hammer. Counterweight's in the way. So the main cap bolts are to be tightened first time around 30 degrees. 30 pound-feet, not 30 degrees, and then the next time around in some odd degrees. I'll look it up in a minute. Surprisingly, the book does not have a chart to see what order to tighten these in, or maybe it does and I haven't found it. But the general rule is to start in the middle and work your way out. Also, I'd like to point out that these are torque to yield bolts, which means you have to torque them down to a amount of rotation like I'm about to do. And the thing to watch out for is on most of these newer engines, the bolts are one-time use and you got to buy new ones every time. Now, the book does not read to replace these bolts, so I'm assuming they're reusable. But I ran into that problem with the Ecotech. The main cap bolts and the rod bolts all had to be replaced. And that was a fun hassle trying to find them. Now the second step, the main cap bolts need to be tightened to 110 degrees of rotation. Now with the last engine build I just kind of faked it and guessed, but this time I actually bought a tool for it. This is for gauging the amount of degrees you turn it. Didn't come with instructions, but I'm assuming this is how it works. You just put a socket on it, put it on top of the bolt, then it's got this thing that, assuming it works like this, and then you anchor it to the side somehow and tighten the set screw, and then you just put a ratchet or a breaker bar or something on and then turn it. Now the side bolts, they get torqued down to 11 first time around, and second time around 45 degrees. Now we're going to replace the pistons with brand new ones from the kit. The rods look pretty clean. They don't really need much of anything. There's the brand new one. As you can see, they're pretty much stock. The compression is going to be the same. These have some kind of coating on the side that are supposed to reduce friction. I don't know, it'd be kind of neat if they do. Okay, the wrist pin is a little snug, but it'll work. Well, not that snug. Another neat thing about replacing the pistons is it's a whole lot faster and easier than cleaning the carbon out of the ring gaps on the old pistons. That is rough work. Make sure you never put this stuff together dry. I'm using engine oil, which should be fine. Now the rings. Now this is kind of neat if you're wondering which is which. The package is marked first on the script. This one's marked second. And this one is marked oil. And the instructions mention which way is up. So before I put them in, we're going to check the ring gap. So I looked in the manual, and the top ring, they want a minimum clearance of 10 thousandths. I think it's like 10 to 18. But I'm not going to get too scientific here. I'm going to assume it's good because the bore has got some wear to it. But I'm going to check it anyway. I have an 11 thousandths gauge here, and if it goes through, then that means it's good, and it goes through easy. You can't see that from the camera because I put it in the wrong direction. Yep. That's fine. Don't have to worry about that. And I'll continue with the rest of them in the same way. Now I looked in the manual and it does say that these timing marks should line up with each other like this. It's good to check on this and not just assume it, because some engines the timing marks need to be opposite each other and some weird stuff like that. But this is the way this one is. reusing the old gears, but I replaced the chain. This one is from Duralast, and it was about 46 bucks. And now the oil pickup. Now it is amazing how many people forget to install these. And if you're wondering, yes, I've done it myself once. Luckily I caught it before I started the engine up. Alright, the timing cover gasket is protruding a little bit here. Looks pretty good here, so we have to trim that down. I just noticed this. With the new gasket, the holes don't quite line up. As you can see over here, it's as far forward as it'll go. And it's the complete opposite back here. Yeah, well, I think it'll work anyway. This is the oil level sending unit, not to be confused with the oil pressure sending unit, which is over on the other side of the engine. Has this O-ring. Now, the rebuild kit came with a bunch of O-rings, but I can't find one that matches up to that. So I'm just going to reuse the old one. And put a bunch of ultra gray on it. And we'll put the lifters in next. I don't really need these until the cylinder head's on, but the longer they sit around, the greater of a chance I'll lose them. And since they're on these guide things, they're not going to fall out if we turn the engine upside down, so it won't hurt anything putting them in now. So, for a comparison, here's the water pump I removed. As you can see, the blades are just completely gone, rusted off. So this was doing little to nothing. This is an aftermarket one I just bought, and as you can see, this is what it's supposed to look like. And now we're about to install the cylinder heads. Now I'd like to point out a few things on this. This is one that came off. This was on the whichever side is the front. And it had like one of these was cracked between both valve seats, but it was a very small crack and it wasn't leaking, so we're just cleaning up the valves and reusing it. The rear head was cracked in several places and the cracks were pretty bad. It was leaking really bad, so we exchanged it for a rebuilt one from O'Reilly, and it was a couple $100 or something like that, but it's all new. And looking closely, it looks like this one's also been cracked maybe, but has been repaired. But it has new valve seats in it, so even if it was cracked, it probably doesn't matter. If you're wondering why I didn't replace both heads, it's because it would cost more, and there's nothing really wrong with the other one anyway. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't go to the junkyard and find a better set of original heads, well, I did. Found another engine and spent the better part of an hour taking the heads off to find out they were also cracked. So apparently that's a big problem with these engines, I guess. Now the cylinder head bolts, the holes go through to the coolant, so you should probably put some sealer on the bolts before putting them in. But these new bolts that I got, looks like they already have them, so I'm not going to do anything with these, just put them in. So first time around, 37 pound-feet of torque. Second time around, 120 degrees of rotation. I installed the rebuilt cylinder head on the right side of the engine because this is towards the firewall when installed, and it's by far the more difficult of the two to remove. And the rebuilt one has less of a chance of failing. So the cracked but still working original one is on the opposite side because this is a lot easier to service with the engine in the car. Now, there's a couple of different intake manifold gasket sets. I'm guessing this is for an earlier model. But this one has these pegs on it and fits like so. These gaskets, they got these pegs on them for alignment, so it's easy to tell which way they go on. And if you put them on backwards, the holes are not even close to lining up, so it's pretty obvious which way they go. And like everything else, I'm going to give a good thorough coating of ultra gray on everything before I install it. Now, one thing you need to watch out for with these intake manifolds is there's a bolt down here that holds it to this head, and there's a bolt back here that holds it to this head. In addition, on the other side there's a bolt down here and one over here, and that's in addition to the ones you can see on the top. So if you need to remove the intake manifold or remove one of the cylinder heads, you need to take the plenum off to get to those two bolts. And it's kind of important to know. It's the next day. I've spent a couple hours putting the rest of the stuff on this thing, and don't worry, you didn't miss anything. It's just a few hours of trying to figure out where all this stuff goes and then degreasing it and all that. So if you have any questions on the rest of this, I'll just do a once over right now and explain what all this stuff is and where it goes. Looking at the left side of the engine, or front, when installed in the car, there's the exhaust manifold. I got the valve cover on it. The dipstick attaches like so, and it's got this front engine mount assembly here that attaches to the manifold stud and bolts onto the head over there. Not much on this side, pretty simple. Now the right side has a lot to it. This is where a lot of the emission controls are. This is the EGR valve. It attaches from the exhaust manifold to the intake manifold. And the tube is held on with a bolt that's under here. It's kind of tricky to get to with the engine in the car. And it's got this bracket here that attaches to the manifold studs. The O2 sensor. This is the secondary air injection. This is probably some kind of valve that operates it. Attaches to the exhaust manifold with two bolts. Also, this thing has two NOx sensors. That's one down there. Has one on the other side of the engine in the same place. Down here, this bracket attaches it to the transaxle. Now these holes are elongated, so I left the bolts loose, and after I bolt it to the transaxle, I'll find some way to tighten those up. So, next thing to do is install the rear main seal housing thing and the flex plate, and then I guess we're ready to throw this in the car. So that's as much as I'm going to assemble it outside the car. Now we're going to throw it in the car and then finish assembly there.